In the previous lessons, we talked about all different kinds of species and their interactions. This would assume that everything stays the same all the time if we didn't talk about succession. So succession is that orderly change over time, and sometimes it's not quite so orderly. So it's not necessarily that it's a prescribed steps, the way that we're going to talk about it, but these are the general progression over time. So um, communities don't always stay the same in areas. As communities grow older, they tend to die off, and then new communities come in and replace them, and that's called ecological succession. So we have two different kinds of succession. We have primary and secondary. Primary meaning that there's no dirt. And that's the biggest difference between primary and secondary. Primary succession, no dirt. Secondary succession has dirt. And by that I mean soil, that it has nutrients in the soil. It might have still some insect activity going on in it. It has nutrients in it that are usable for plants. So we talk about some examples of primary succession. We're going to talk about areas where that's not available anymore, and so it takes a lot longer for primary succession to occur because soil has to be established in those areas. So primary succession is where we start from nothing. Usually this happens because of a volcanic eruption. It could be glaciers are receding and they've actually scraped away all the topsoil. This could be an area where there was a lake and the lake water receded, and now there needs to be soil building that occurs in that particular area. So once again, this takes a little bit longer because soil first has to establish it. And in the intro video, this is where they were talking about mosses and lichens. Lichens are the scaly kind of plant life that's on rocks. It's very well stuck on there. It could be green or orange or yellow. It can come in lots of different colors. But the lichens actually are putting their roots down into the rock itself. They release an enzyme that actually starts to dissolve the rock, and that's what makes pockets of soil. So when you look on the sides of cliffs and you see this weird tree that's like hanging out of the side of the rock, lichens first came in there and started to break that rock apart, and so that soil could actually start to accumulate into little crevices within the rock and start that whole process where something could actually grow there. So here's a picture of some lichens. You can see where, so the cracks in the rocks aren't necessarily because of the lichen. In this area, it's probably freeze and thaw. So as the area, as rainwater falls or snow melt gets into the cracks of the rocks, when it freezes, that expands and it pushes apart the rock. Excuse me. It's called frost wedging, and so you start to get these cracks, these linear cracks like this in rock. But the lichens, as it breaks down the rock, then provides that soil, which then we can start to have our grasses and shrubs and things like that grow into it. So in the United States, we actually have a really good example of where primary succession has occurred in the area around Mount St. Helens. So Mount St. Helens was there's national forest all the way around the volcano and the volcano itself. And it was an area that was used for timber harvesting, and so there was a lot of data that had been collected, a lot of photo points that had been taken to show how the forest was changing over time. And so some of the pictures that we're going to be looking at were photo points that were established prior to the eruption, and then they got to as close as they could. Now remember, this is pre-GPS, so they're doing this with maps. And where it is in relation to the mountain, but remember that after the eruption happened, there was a big change in how the mountain looked, and so, they got as close as they could. If you're not familiar with the eruption at Mount St. Helens blew off about 2/3 of its mass when it erupted. It had a mass of magma that moved up through in the magma chamber, the shaking of that, and the fact that it moved up kind of unevenly through it, so it kind of caused a bulge on the side that's facing us in this picture. The bulge was kind of on this side. And then as magma moves up through the magma chamber, it can cause earthquakes. And it had a series of, or it was called an earthquake swarm, so a series of earthquakes that caused a landslide on the side of the mountain that's closest to us in this picture. And when that landslide happened, it was kind of like uncorking a bottle. It released the pressure. And so the explosion actually happened outwards towards us and then upwards as well. And so areas that this is actually some of the outflow from the eruption itself, which is why it looks a bit different than it did here, because it all came down this way. So not only that, but the top part of the mountain got pulverized. It got mixed up with, there was ice caps on the top of there was glaciers. So that got mixed up, and so then it caused what's called a lahar, or a mudslide. Superheated gas, mud, and rock came flowing out like a river out, and it actually, a lot of people died from the lahar, um, more so than like magma. This isn't like you think of Hawaii and the nice red hot magma coming out and oozing out. That's not this kind of eruption. This is a composite volcano that erupts under a great amount of pressure, and so it's very explosive, and it tends to have what are called pyroclastic flows, which also occurred in here, which is superheated gas and rock that moves about as fast as a train can go. Um, and it comes in big billowy clouds and such. So not really what you think about that classic Hawaiian eruption. It's very different. Obviously, very devastating effects. The first thing that happened was the shock wave came, and it actually knocked down all the trees. And it blew a lot of them into Spirit Lake, which then had to undergo its own, so it had an aquatic sort of succession that occurred in that particular lake. So looking from a little bit of a different vantage point, coming a little bit further out. So the eruption happened in 1980. You're looking at it 1 year after. Now we're looking a little further out. Still not seeing much of anything alive in this one here. But here you can start to see green showing up amongst the rocks. A little bit of shrubbery, a little bit of weeds. Our pioneer species, they have to be tough. They have to make soil. They have to be able to live in very harsh conditions. 25 years later, though, we're looking at a nice amount of vegetation, but 25 years now, in successional terms, kind of a blink of an eye. But for humans, being able to monitor this as it's going along, it's pretty cool to be able to see the changes. So we're on the sides of the cone here. You see it right after the blast. We have some other kinds of primary succession that occur too. Not just things like not violent as volcanic eruptions. So sand, newly washed up sand from the seashore, doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. So these grasses and things have to get their roots down in there, and then they start trapping in, and they start to have dead material getting trapped in there, and so they can break down and start to form soil. Talked about when glaciers recede. So till is what's left behind. So this whole side right here, so this is a glacial lake. So the glacier is actually like on our side of the picture, is where it would have receded back this way from us, and it left what's called a moraine, which is what this is right here. That was the terminal moraine, or the end of the glacier. And as this dries up, this lake dries up, which unless it has continuous water being fed down from a glacier coming into it, it will dry up. And then even on the moraine over here, it had to reestablish. A lot of times what you find in moraines is lots of different sizes of rocks, because the glacier just kind of picked everything up, and then as it melted, it just kind of dropped everything where it was at. So they're what's called unevenly sorted, so you tend to have like giant rock piles and stuff. Looking again at Mount St. Helens. So secondary successions, that was all primary succession, no dirt left. Right, so secondary succession is where there wasn't quite that much of a disturbance. So this could be like a field that got plowed. This could be where a forest fire came through, but there's still dirt there. So this kind of succession happens much more quickly. And the example we're going to look at is Yellowstone. So when Yellowstone burned, it was pretty devastating. It burned about between a third and a half of the park. Um, but it didn't burn it in its entirety. It burned patches. So it's kind of like what they call a mosaic pattern. Yellowstone evolved. Um, the plants and the vegetation there evolved with a fire cycle of between 150 and 200 years, which is about how long it had been since it had burned before. And so this type of forest um, undergoes what they call catastrophic stand replacing fires, and that's how it renews the ecosystem. And so what happened here was started by lightning. Nature started it, and nature put it out around Thanksgiving time when it started to snow. The fire started early in the summer and went all the way through till until about Thanksgiving. All people did was kind of herd it around the buildings, and things like that, but it pretty much did what it wanted to do. But you see that right after the fire, you're already starting to see seedlings. And there's a video about Yellowstone that's on here, and they'll talk about the fact that the nutrients that were pushed down into the soil it actually pushes carbon down into the soil and it pushes nitrogen down into the soil. So it actually acts like a fertilizer. It opens up the canopy so that grasses can start to grow. It just takes a while for the trees to come back. But there are some trees they're going to talk about, jack pine in the video. It has what's called a serotinous cone, which means that it's coated with like this waxy layer. And the only way that jack pine can actually reproduce, and lodgepole pine, which is what this is, does this also. It's the only ways that those cones can reproduce is if they undergo a fire. The fire actually melts the waxy coating on the outside of it and releases the seeds. So lodgepole pine also has other kinds of seeds that don't, or other kinds of cones that don't require fire, but they also have these sticky cones that are the tree has adapted so that even if everything dies, these cones will open up and release seed, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool adaptation. So here's in a field, so we said it could happen in a place where, farmers um, let a field go fallow. So in this top picture, they're showing where it had just been harvested, the grass and weeds starting to come in, and then it actually is acting like a meadow that's being encroached upon, so you're starting to see trees starting to grow. So it takes much less time. When you consider when we looked at Yellowstone and what it took 25 years to even to be able to start to look like this, trees were still a little bit further out in the Yellowstone area. And then after 40 years, basically the forest has reclaimed the field. So a much faster process. So when we have lots of different species, we talked a lot about this a little bit before, about how important biodiversity is to the resilience, or that ability to kind of roll with the punches and deal with change in ecosystems. And so having a lot to be stable and sustainable, we really need to have diverse ecosystems. And so when you look at environmental science too, and you start looking at like the kinds of things that we do to ecosystems and how we start to reduce the amount of biodiversity in ecosystems, we're really reducing their ability to sustain a disturbance and to bounce back after that disturbance. Because the greater the diversity is, the more likely the area is to bounce back.